So we've reached the end of week 4, and once again there's been a really great conversation happening, Craig. It's been really good to see such a dynamic conversation. Some really great points have come up this week actually, particularly around self-compassion. I mean, that's obviously been a very important and interesting topic for a lot of people.
It's a challenging one in some ways as well.
Sure, isn't it?
Yeah.
Being kind to ourselves when things are difficult is a big challenge, and it's certainly brought up a lot for people. A few people actually talked about self-criticism, and you know, there are different reasons that we have self-criticism, but one is that it's sometimes the internalised voice of our caregivers. You know, if we're raised by people who are very critical, you know, we tend to start relating to ourselves the way that our primary caregivers relate to us and relate to themselves when we're growing up.
Yes, and I think in a way we can, if we have had adverse experiences in our past, and we all will have to a greater or lesser extent, I guess there are two ways of using those adverse experiences, either as a learning opportunity and to turn it into something useful, or to just continually ruminate on it and be negative about ourselves or the world. And clearly the more mindful thing to do is to learn from that experience. Okay, so it was uncomfortable and so on, but what's it going to show me? How am I going to take this lesson and turn it into something useful in my life? And that's not always easy.
No. And that's one of the things about self-compassion that's actually so useful. You know, the research shows that students who fail a test and are then self-compassionate, they just spend less time caught up in ruminating on the failure and more time focused on learning what they needed to know in the first place.
Yeah.
And the experience itself becomes less sort of unpleasant, and they actually do better on the retest. So
yes, because the self-criticism consumes a lot of attention, a lot of energy and a lot of time, and that's the energy and attention and time that could be taken for getting on with and dealing with the issue.
Absolutely.
There were some other things that came up too about feeling stressed at work and the pressure and demands, and then going on a holiday and pretty soon after coming down with an illness. And this is something that's actually quite often seen. It's almost like we get into a bit of an overdraft, if you like, you know, running on adrenaline the whole time, and it dysregulates our immune system, produces a wear and tear on a system called allostatic load, which has been previously mentioned. But the delayed effects of that in impact on immunity can sometimes take days or weeks to have an effect, particularly with inflammation, but also with suppressed immunity. So people very often notice that they get through a pressured period at work, have a holiday, but of course the immune system's been going down, and then the exposure to something, and then there's a few days delay between exposure and coming down with an infection. So it's very often there's a bit of a lag time. We sort of think, well, wait a sec, why am I getting sick while I'm on holiday? Shouldn't I have gotten sick? Well, probably we would have gotten sick at work, but sometimes there is a delayed effect.
Do you have any tips for the learners about how to use mindfulness to manage that in stressful periods?
Well, I think pacing ourselves is really important, knowing how to stop and to refuel and refresh these little mini moments during the day of just the pressure and adrenaline builds up to sort of just check it and just to take that down a step, and so to be doing that regularly during the day and to know how to switch off and especially sleep well at night is very important. And I think that these days with a lot of the technology, people are never switching off, even late at night or in the middle of the night, and disrupting sleep and so on. If we want a recipe for feeling down and depressed and sacrificing our immunity, it's keep doing that. Yeah. And one other thing that came up briefly as well was about dreaming. A few people had noticed that the mindfulness had made them more aware of their dreams and the mental activity. And the more default mode we notice at night, the more we start, during the day, the more we start to notice at night. So people often say in the initial phases becoming more aware of dreams and so on. And that tends to settle over time. So over weeks and months, people often notice that initially more aware of dreams, but then the sleep starts to become deeper and more deep, and that really restorative kind of sleep. So that settles down. But I think it's a part of the higher level of awareness generally of what's happening in the mind.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is of course one of the main things that we're cultivating with mindfulness and awareness.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. There were other comments about self-compassion as well. There was a really great conversation that happened about that. It was really great to see. Some people saying that there are times in their lives when they can be quite self-compassionate, but you know, a few people said that there were particular incidents, particular relationships that they just found it very hard to be kind to themselves around, which is of course I mean, that just makes sense, doesn't it? I think we all have sort of sticking points and areas where it's hard to be kind to ourselves and where that self-criticism kicks in. We should say as well, I mean, that self-criticism serves a role. It you know, quite often when we're being very tough on ourselves, it's designed to try to motivate us, or to, you know, it's a self-improvement project, or to avoid making mistakes or repeating them anyway, or protecting relationships. You know, you hurt someone's feelings, give yourself a hard time, but certainly it's very important to be kind to ourselves, particularly when things are hard, when we're suffering.
Yeah, and even to notice those times when it's very difficult.
Yes.
People say, oh, do I have to forgive? Do I have to feel compassion for somebody? And in a sense, no, we don't have to. But if we're going to be more mindful, well, then at least we can start to bring awareness to the effect of not forgiving or not feeling compassion, to notice the effect it has on our mind, how we feel, how we respond, how we relate. And if we can bring some awareness to that, even in a non-judgmental kind of way, it starts to inform us, gee, that's coming at a cost.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, it's not about somebody else wagging the finger and saying you have to forgive, you have to... But we have to actually make that conscious decision for ourselves and to see the cost of being self-critical or critical of others. And a lot of the time, there's quite a lot of awareness to gain around that before we sort of crystallise in our own minds, no, this is costing a lot more than I'm getting out of it. And so it sometimes takes a little bit of time, I think.
And I think that's a great approach. I mean, this whole attitude of treating what we're doing here as an experiment, you know, just noticing the effect of being self-critical is very important. And then noticing the times that we are a bit kinder, and the difference between those two ways of relating to ourselves.
Well, certainly caring was a big theme that came up. Caring for others, particularly others in need and when ill. And we won't say any more about that other than being able to be mindful is a very important part of being able to care for others. But reframing things and being grateful. And I think that it's an interesting thing, often when we just stop and acknowledge the moment, we sort of take pleasure in or enjoy the things, or are grateful for things that we're often taking for granted when we're just on automatic pilot. And the ability to reframe, to cognitively reframe. Now, it's not implicit in mindfulness. It's not like it is, in a sense, exactly what mindfulness is, but it's like a capacity that mindfulness makes easier to do. So if we're more mindful, it makes it easier to examine the thoughts and to make decision about which thoughts we're going to give attention to, which ones are going to motivate us. So people very often find, as a natural side effect of being more mindful, that it makes it easier to reframe things, easier to look at things in a different perspective. And that's probably one of the things that helps, say, underpin CBT, is that some mindfulness actually helps people to even appraise the thoughts, the contents of the thoughts. So although it's not inherent in mindfulness, I think it's one of the applications of mindfulness, the ability to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. There were also some comments about the loving kindness practice, which was interesting, because in a way, I guess, there was a bit of a change of gears for some people. We'd gone from cultivating this awareness and this presence, which of course had these attitudes of kindness that we'd been exploring through that metaphor of training the puppy, or just sort of practicing that gentleness as we bring our attention back. But I think it was a bit of a change of gears for some people, and certainly brought up a lot of lively discussion. So it was certainly it's a very useful practice, I think, for a lot of people, and some people, of course, found it very, very beneficial, and others sort of weren't quite sure how it fitted in with mindfulness. And I guess what I'd say about that is that this attitude of being compassionate, kind to ourselves, is implicit in mindfulness. Any time that we are in the present moment with that attitude of acceptance, I mean, that's naturally there. And once we learn to do that with ourselves, it just starts to very naturally flow out to others. Yes,
and there's a neuroplasticity issue here as well, because if we're practicing self-criticism or being critical or angry with others, then that's pretty much wiring itself into the brain as well. So consciously choosing to engender another particular kind of thought or attitude has a different effect. But I think that it is, in some ways, quite a change of gear, and people may find ready for that, not ready for that. But we want to provide a whole menu of different things in this course, and that being one of them. And it may be the kind of thing in a month or 6 months or 5 years from now, somebody comes back to and says, no, I think I'm ready to explore that in more depth.
Yeah, absolutely.
There were some issues as well that came up around self-esteem, and which are probably worth spending a few moments on as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are different types of self-esteem. I think that's one thing we were talking about before, that it's really useful to acknowledge that some self-esteem is just feeling good about ourselves just because, and of course then there's that type of self-esteem that's based on our performance and how well we're doing. And then there's another type again, which we talked about, which is about sort of comparing ourselves with others, or there's often a judgment that's kind of implicit in that. And that can be a sort of a less healthy type of self-esteem.
Very fragile, very vulnerable to the like or the dislike.
That's right, exactly.
Constantly searching for this and constantly afraid of that.
Yes.
And then I think in a lot of ways our social media these days is engendering that kind of
like
attitude.
and dislike buttons, right?
That attitude to self-esteem, and it's very fragile.
Yes, absolutely. And self-compassion researcher Kristen Neff, she talks a lot about it, particularly I think a very Western type of self-esteem where there is an attitude of comparison with others, which is the most fragile of all. I mean, great recipe for making yourself unhappy is just to start comparing yourself with others.
Constantly, yeah.
Absolutely. And so when things are difficult, being self-compassionate rather than trying to build our self-esteem can at times be a very healthy response to that.
Yeah, and it depends a lot on what we take ourselves to be. So if we take ourselves to be, I don't know, the most superficial part of ourselves, then it's a very fragile kind of self-esteem. But if we understand ourselves to be that sort of inner awareness, that still sort of central essence of our being, then that's a lot more resilient.
Yes.
And it's a lot easier to be more self-honest or honest to others from that point. And that's a much more stable kind of self-esteem, and that is, I think, what mindfulness can teach us more about, is how to sort of rest in that, and then it makes it easier to confront all the other things and to deal with the likes and dislikes and approval and disapproval. Yeah. And Rudyard Kipling's poem "If," I think, he's got some lines about this, about which I won't quote now, and maybe you want to have a look at the poem "If," but it's very much that kind of resilience too, and I think that really requires that kind of much greater awareness of ourselves that mindfulness can offer.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so some great conversation once again, so please keep contributing, keep exploring the different concepts and the different practices, and we're certainly having a good time learning about the learning. So.
Fantastic. Look forward to speaking to you next week.